Good evening. I'd like to call to order the February 19th, 2015 meeting of the City of Bellingham Planning Commission. I'd like to ask everybody to turn off or silence their electronic devices, anything that makes noise, phones, laptops if you're using one. Please put it on mute for us. Thank you. Heather, would you please call the roll?
Tom Grinstead.
Here.
Jeff Brown.
Here.
Garrett O'Brien.
Here.
Wally Taishi.
Here.
Phyllis McKee. Here. Steve Crooks.
Here.
And Cerise Snow is absent.
Thank you, Heather. I'd like to welcome everyone. Looks like we've got some students, so welcome all students here to our Planning Commission meeting. Before we get into our agenda, I'd just like to take a minute to talk briefly about a training that a few of us attended last week on Robert's Rules, which are the rules that govern this commission. And we learned a lot about how things work and some things we were doing right and some things we were doing not wrong, but maybe in the wrong order. So one thing I'd like to do before we get started is ask the commission, I'd like to ask a member to make a motion to authorize our secretary and the planning department staff to participate and give us feedback when we're operating outside of the rules of our organization. And I can explain why after we have a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, so just to explain this briefly, one thing we learned is that if authorized, that our staff from the planning department and our secretary can participate and help us through points of order and through informing us about the rules when we might not be abiding by them. And I know that we have those interactions anyway with staff and with the secretary, but what was brought to our attention for this training was that it's really appropriate to authorize them formally to do that. So this is really just housekeeping, but I'd just like to get it out of the way. And so if there's no other discussion or questions, we can call the vote unless someone has something to contribute. Okay, let's just do a quick head nod vote on this. All in favor?
Aye.
All right,
Aye.
unanimous. So next up is approval of previous meetings minutes. We've got 3 sets of minutes. I'd like to take these minutes in bulk unless there's any discussion and move to approve all 3. Or ask for a motion, I should say, to approve all 3.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, any discussion on the minutes? This is the minutes of November 20th, January 8th, and January 15th. All right, let's call the vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, unanimous. Okay, next up is the public comment period. This is a situation where anyone from the public, anyone here, can come up to the podium where Brian Smart is standing now and speak to us for a short period of time about any topic that is not on our agenda for this evening. And our agenda this evening includes a public meeting to discuss construction of a new 3,000 square foot bank building in the Roosevelt neighborhood, and also a public hearing on a rezone request for 801 Samish Way. So if you are interested in talking about anything at all that is unrelated to those 2 topics, now's your chance to get up and say something. You have 3 minutes to speak. And if anyone wants to, they can just come to the podium. Okay, seeing no one, we're going to close the public comment period. And we have 2 items on the agenda tonight, a public meeting on the bank proposal and a public hearing on the rezone. And we're going to do the public meeting first. So I think at this point, we'll just move into that and let Brian Smart from the city start with a staff presentation.
Thank you. As you said, Commissioner Taishi, we're here tonight for a proposed bank building on the last undeveloped parcel in Area 16, which is the last parcel is actually at the corner, the southwestern corner of Orleans and Barclay Boulevard, and it's within what's affectionately known as the larger Lowe's Development Center. So real quickly, this is parcel E, parcel D, other out parcels within here. The bank building is going to be located here. In 2001, this area was rezoned under a resolution. Within that resolution, there were specific design standards and building standards for the development of this whole area. All of the overall site development standards for this area have been met, But within those design standards, there's a requirement for a mandatory public meeting for any project proposed to come before Planning Commission. Specifically, this was added because development on parcel D, which again is this fronting parcel, raises significant planning issues, and a mandatory public meeting shall be held with the Planning Commission as part of the planned contract review process, which is a process that this proposal is already under. This requirement was due to adjacent residential uses across Orleans and to the east that were having concerns with large commercial development. And I'll briefly highlight the applicable design standards for this project. So again, the site area is this undeveloped parcel here. Currently, WECU is here, another financial institution here. There's a restaurant and a couple other commercial uses here, and the residential is on this side. Again, the main Lowe's Center is over here. And for this parcel in particular, for building scale, the building height will be limited to 1 or 2 stories adjacent to Orleans with a maximum height of 25 feet. This design standard has been met as the building is 1 story and 16 feet maximum at its highest level. There is a corner architectural element, and that'll be 25 feet. The building square footage, development on parcel D is limited to single-story buildings with a maximum of 25,000 square feet. This design standard has also been met because this is development on parcel D. The building is only 3,000 square feet, and it is 1 story in height. I'd like to skip over 3C, but we'll come back to that later. There's transition areas between parcels A and D. I'll go back to the original site plan for the area. Again, D and A. There was for a 15-foot wide pedestrian corridor to extend from the north side trail corridor up to Barclay Boulevard. As you can see by the dashed line, the larger one out here, this is a public trail corridor, and there's also an internal trail corridor here. All these development improvements are complete. They were done with the main Lowe's Center and then 2 of the other additional buildings here. So all of the overall site plan stuff has been taken care of. Pedestrian walkways provide internal connections between buildings on all parcels. Again, this design standard has been met as there's internal connection between the major Lowe's Center throughout the property and connecting east to west. No parking is to be located between Orleans Street and the buildings on parcel D. Again, this design standard has been met as there are no parking stalls located between the building and the street, and I'll use the applicant's slides here to go to the site plan. So we'll go to the next larger one. The building is right along the property line here, and this is drive-through aisles for the bank. No drive lanes or drive-through lanes or pickup windows will be located between the buildings and Orleans Street. Again, I think you're seeing a theme that this design standard has been met. There are no drive lanes or drive-through lanes between the building and the street. The area between the drive-through lanes and the property line will be heavily landscaped, and there's an architectural wall designed to help buffer from the vehicles to the pedestrian walkway that's there. And I'll use the applicant's slides. You can see this is the view looking across Orleans. And this is the view looking towards Lowe's if you're standing on the Orleans side sidewalk. If I can go back to item 3C. Building orientation and design. It says preference will be given to plans including buildings clustered around pedestrian spaces and the pedestrian-oriented spaces and building entrances visible from Orleans and from the Orleans portion of the trail corridor. And I emphasize that. Buildings designed and sited to avoid the service side of the building fronting Orleans Street. Design features will be addressed through the planned contract and may include canopies, windows, building articulation, and varying roof lines to promote neighborhood compatibility. These building and site design standards have been partially met. The building is aligned with Orleans Street portion of the trail corridor. The exterior features include wall and roof modulation, canopies, and assortment of materials on the facade. As I mentioned before, staff believes the design of the screening wall and landscaping along the drive-through lanes is an assortment of, helps buffer the street pedestrian edge along Orleans. However, the building entry is oriented towards Barclay Boulevard. And we'll go to the larger site plan. The building entry located here. It is the opinion of staff that the pedestrian-oriented access from Orleans Street is exceptionally limited, and staff has difficulty with the lack of building entrance visible from Orleans Street as the preferred design standard. Staff is suggesting the entry be relocated to the southeastern corner of the building and that the screening wall be moved south, increasing the drive aisle screening and opening the area nearest to the relocated entry. So again, the entry is facing Barclay, The entry is facing Barclay Boulevard here. Staff is suggesting to meet that design standard that the entry be relocated to this corner and that the wall be shifted south. As you can see, there's more drive aisle in this area. If the wall were moved south, it would screen more of the headlights, more of the traffic view, and it would actually open up this area for more visibility. As designed, the pedestrian access point along Orleans Street appears to be more of a peephole rather than a main entry leading to the building. Staff is looking for any additional recommendations from commissioners in order to assist the applicant in meeting this design standard. And if there aren't any other questions, or any questions, Steve?
Thank you, Brian.
Sure.
I've got a question on moving that wall to the south.
Okay.
Steve, could you use mic, please?
Sorry about that. The existing main entry on Orleans Street is really a non-functional entry other than just the trail. There's no parking on Orleans Street. All the traffic that's going to enter the building will come from the west side or the left side into the building. For what purpose are we going to move that wall to the south? It makes no sense. It makes no sense to move the main entrance to that corner because, again, all the traffic is going to come from the parking lot. Now, I don't understand why staff is getting into the design arena here and telling some architects that have already perfected this design what to do.
What staff is actually looking for is recommendations from Planning Commission on how to meet a directive in the design standards. The intent was to have entry orientation to Orleans Street.
But there's no parking there. You're not going to have a great number of customers coming along the trail jogging, turn into the bank and continue jogging or walking. Everybody is going to come from the parking lot. That makes no sense. You've got an entry on Orleans, and that's my suggestion. I just don't see changing the design for something that's non-functional.
Jeff?
Okay.
So I had a similar thought, but I'll actually put this more in the terms of a question. I do realize that the design standards were written without knowing what kind of building was going to be built there, and that, you know, an ice cream store on a trail is a different matter than a bank with parking and drive-through access. But what I'm kind of curious about is two things. One is, now that you know what use is actually there, is there a variance process to make the functional layout of the facility appropriate with the design standards that weren't specific to that use? That's the first question. The second question is, based on WICU or other financial institutions in the area, did staff look at what percentage of people arrive by car versus walking off the path? Because I don't use that branch that often, but I actually don't know that I remember people walking in off the path as opposed to using the parking lot. And so given the two things, the second is what data is there that actually supports an emphasis on how important that design standard is, and the first one is actually, is there a variance or is there any way that we can actually discuss not strictly how to fulfill a design guideline, but what is actually appropriate for this use in this location?
I don't know of any study done for pedestrian usage on that. As a WICU member, I've used that branch before. I would say yes, like this area is very auto-oriented, and the intent of these design standards was to help reduce the effect of being so auto-oriented. We have, as I said, residential uses to the north, and we have residential uses to the east. And so the intent was to help these residential uses not feel the impact of such a high volume of traffic. I think we all know, if you've been out there, you know that area is very full of traffic. The intent here was to create a more pedestrian-oriented feel. One way to do that is to have building entrances facing the street. Much like most of our urban villages, this was actually ahead of its time for our urban villages. Now we pretty much have the requirements, and same with our big box, to locate the buildings up to the front and put the parking in the back. So again, for a variance, that's kind of why we're here tonight, is to look for recommendations from Planning Commission on how to meet a design standard that's already in this specific area.
Phyllis?
Well, I would tend to agree that unless moving the entrance to the Orleans side is going to reduce the number of cars, if that's not what's going to happen as a result of that, which I don't imagine would, it would seem more logical to me that the entrance be visible from the parking area, and maybe something nice for the people walking by on the trail on that side. I could see something that would be, interesting to look at, but not necessarily the entrance of the bank. It's just a thought.
And staff truly has no issue with the design of the building. And staff has actually talked with the architect and the property owner about this design and the materials involved with it. I think as I said, it offers the canopies, roof articulation, variety of materials. Really the only sticking point is that the entry, as preferred in the design standards, is not facing Orleans. WICU, while they face east, as somebody's coming down that trail corridor, you still see that building entry. With the, I think it's an eye doctor use just east of that, there's also building entries along that side. So again, staff is looking for direction or recommendation on how to meet that design standard.
So, real quick, Tom, did you have a question for Brian?
One of my stupid Norwegian questions, is a design standard an actual requirement?
The way I see it written into the resolution, that is the direction that was given for this development.
So it's a direction, but not a requirement. Is that what you're telling me?
How I read the ordinance is that there's preferred design elements that have to be included into these proposals.
Thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that real quick? This section that you've got on page 2 of our staff report, it says subsection 5, proposal details and development design standards. Is that taken directly from the resolution, the ordinance, or the
Yes.
resolution? Okay. I would just like to note that 3A, 3B, 3D, 3E, 5A and 5B all say you will do this or you will do that. And 3C says preference will be given to plans, including buildings, cluster, and pedestrian spaces. So I don't necessarily read it the same way. I feel like when it says you will have a building that's under 2 stories, that's pretty quantifiable. But this standard actually is the only one that isn't explicit. It says preference will be given, and I really don't know what that means. Does that mean that if you had 2 proposals, you would choose one over the other? Because how do you give preference to a proposal in a vacuum where there's nothing to compare it to?
Unfortunately, we don't have 2 proposals in front of us.
Yeah.
And as I see it, the preferred design standard is that with pedestrian-oriented spaces and building entrances visible from Orleans and from the Orleans portion of the trail corridor. Example, Wiku. It doesn't front directly onto it, but you can see it from Orleans Street and you can see it from the Orleans Trail corridor.
Okay.
And Steve, that was the intent behind staff's suggestion of having the entrance there and sliding that wall back. Because if the applicant was to locate the entrance to the center, say here, again, this wall that's intended to buffer the drive lanes would still block the entrance. If the entrance was located here, that would, be more in line with what's with Wiku. But again, staff is looking for recommendations.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Phyllis.
Well, either one. Just a question, is there any reason there can't be 2 entrances, one on Orleans and one on the parking lot side?
That was discussed with the applicant, but I'm going to punt that question to them.
Steve?
In what form do we make these recommendations to you?
It would be through the minutes of tonight's discussion.
So no motion is required. We just list some different ideas for staff to consider. And what follow-up do you have with us after you review those
It would come through
recommendations?
findings when we write up the plan development permit for this project. Ultimately, the director makes the decision on it, but we would take the recommendations that you have for this and write those up in findings, then the permit.
Can we make a motion?
I wouldn't see why not. You're the
Yeah,
commission.
I guess that's more of a discussion topic, because I think we can make a motion as a group if we have consensus on a recommendation and couch it in the form of a motion.
I think that would be
Yeah.
appropriate.
One thing I'd like to ask the commission is if there's more clarifying questions for Brian, we can ask him now, but in a public meeting format, we have the option to allow the public to speak, and I think it's fair to allow the public to speak if there's anyone here who wants to speak about it. So maybe we let the public speak. If the applicant's here to speak, let them speak, and then we have our more robust discussion about the topics that Steve, you raised, and Jeff and Phyllis, you guys raised. So if everyone's okay with that, see head nods, let's thank you, Brian.
Sure.
And what we'll do is we'll treat this just like a public hearing situation. If you want to speak about this proposal, come on up. There's no sign-up sheet, so just line up along the wall and state your name and your address for the record, and then please limit your comments to 3 minutes so we can move through this. Thank you.
Commissioner, I'm, on behalf of the applicant, am I limited to 3 minutes as well?
You know, are you the only person speaking on behalf of the applicant?
The president of the bank is here as well.
Okay, I'd like to limit everyone's comments equally, just because it's a public meeting forum, and I think it's fair, unless the commissioners feel that the applicant should get more time. I'm open to that if it's a consensus.
I'd like to explain the design that Brian has focused on
Okay.
and the rationale behind it.
Jeff, you just suggested five minutes? Okay. We'll go with 5 minutes.
I'll go fast.
Thank you.
Jeffrey Oliphant, Sunset Drive Investors, P.O. Box 1294, Auburn 98071. We're the original developer of the shopping center going back to 2000. I think Steve Sundin from the city and I are the only folks here from way back when this plan contract was put together. I'm going to skip the slides. I'm just going to go right through the concerns that Brian had raised. When we went through this at the very beginning, the primary concern as related to the folks across the street on Orleans were a few residences in those homes. They were at that time, they were non-conforming uses. That property is commercially zoned. I assume it still is today. The concern that those residents when they came to the meeting were headlights from the cars in the parking lot or going through the drive-throughs and noise. Those were their primary concerns. We've addressed those in the plan contract. We continue to address them. That's why the buildings are on that side of the lot. That's why no parking can be between the building and those things. That's why no drive-throughs, all the rest of that stuff. Very clear, we've met all the requirements. And the preference thing, that's why everything else, Commissioner, you were correct. Everything else says will or shall or must. Not just in here, but everywhere else in the contract had to do with Lowe's everywhere. And the reason is this one item is inconsistent with everything else in here. You can't meet this requirement in a logical way while you're doing everything else. We have a trail. We're not allowed to penetrate the trail. Not allowed to do anything in the trail, yet the entrance is to be on a walking trail. How do you run a commercial business on a walking trail? We're not supposed to have lights on that side of the building to shine into people's homes. How do you have a building without an entrance? If the entrance is to be facing them, the lights are shining in there. Noise. We're allowed to have a bar here. It was the strangest thing. The zoning said we can't have a supermarket here. This was the original site, by the way, for Safeway. That got turned down through a bunch of political stuff back then. But the issue was that we did not want to disturb the neighbors across the street. We built Barclay. We're the ones who actually built Barclay. If you look at the angle of Barclay, if you stop at that light, you're shining your headlights right into one of those homes because Barclay does not line up straight. So we're not a real issue with any of these things. But this thing was just a preference. It was not a requirement. That's really the crux of it, and it's because you can't do the trail. You can't do the other things. You can't have the parking. You want everybody to walk around the building. It does not make sense. Everybody's coming by car. As you asked, the implicit in the thing is no one's coming to go to a bank or any of these other businesses. Very few are coming by bike or by walking. It's a car-oriented part of the city. If you want, I can run through the slides real quick, whatever you'd like. I'm just sensitive to the time. As far as the, pardon?
Got 2 minutes.
We'll run through the slides real quick. I also want with me here is the president of First Federal Bank, who's going to be the tenant on here. They have some concerns with regard to the two entrance question, which I'm going to let them address. Brian showed me how to do this. The main facade there, the main corner entry, that's cedar. It's cultured stone, cedar. We meet all of the design standards. We tried to make, this is looking at it from the corner of Orleans and Barclay. We wanted to make it attractive. It is not the rear end of a building. Frankly, it's a very nice end of the building. You've got windows, you've got canopies, you've got a main corner feature. We're not treating it as the back of the building. We've already gone through this stuff. We did create, at the staff's suggestion, a direct entrance off of the trail to come around the building. You can also come from Barclay. You can see that entrance right here. It's the only place. We did not have to do that for Waku. We did it here. We're connecting directly so you can come into the bank. You can also see here the headlights coming straight in to this house. We're trying to protect that house. We've got a big tree that we've kept here from the original development that actually pre-exists us to help protect that house. South elevation, this is facing towards Waku. The west elevation is facing towards the parking lot. Again, we're treating all the sides of the building equally. See how dominant the cedar element is throughout. Cultured stone. This is a very nice building. We've tried to protect the drive-through. So again, even though we're not required to, we wanted to protect it again from any issues. That's pretty much it.
Perfect.
And that's the entrance from the inside. That's it, I guess.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to, if I could, call up Larry Hewitt, who is the president of First Federal Bank.
Sure.
Good evening. My name is Larry Hewitt, President and CEO of First Federal Savings and Loan of Port Angeles. My address is 105 West 8th Street, Port Angeles, Washington. I want to thank the Commission for letting us make this presentation tonight and to address some of your concerns. From the bank's perspective, we have safety concerns. Banks are often targets of robbery, and I believe one of the commissioners asked about having 2 entrances. We feel that that puts our staff, our customers, who are residents of your community at greater risk than the design that you see before you tonight. We also feel that there will be extra security needs if we have to have cameras on both sides. Talking about the lighting that would be necessary for the exterior of the building. Our plans for this location are to offer services beyond the normal operating hours through ATMs and ITMs, which are interactive teller machines. And that is going to allow access beyond the regular hours when staff would be there, again, increasing our safety concerns if the design is altered. So I don't have anything really more to say at this point, but I'm here to answer any questions if you have them.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else who'd like to speak on this topic? Okay, seeing no one, I think we'll close the opportunity for public comment and turn it back over to the commission for discussion. So if anyone has any other comments to add or questions for staff or just internal discussion, this is the time. Mr. Grinstad.
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple of comments. You know, as an architect, yeah, it's really hard for me to second guess a design without being privy to the programming that went into it. But as other commissioners have said, the main entry, I think, should face the parking lot. Most of the customers are there. They will arrive by car, they will depart by car. The planning documents say preferred off of Orleans, but it's not a hard and fast requirement. The fact is that both Barclay and Orleans are arterials, which have no parking in the immediate vicinity, so nobody's going to park on those arterials and walk by sidewalk to the bank. And the only folks who would arrive by foot are those who would wander up from the south, walking along the path there on the west side of Orleans, or if they come from the other residential areas to the east, they have to use the crosswalk, and I would imagine walk along the sidewalk on Barclay and then down the parking lot to the main entry. I just believe that I would bet 95% of the clients would be using that parking lot entry. I do have maybe a suggestion. Moving that buffer fence to the south, as staff has said, and spend a little money making a trellis or a canopy from the southeast corner of the building along the south of the building and then turn the corner to the main entry. That in my mind would give an entrance, a visible entrance from the Orleans side, and it'll direct folks, right to the main entry. So I would I would see that as probably or possibly a compromise or a solution to this if staff and the proponent are agreeable.
Jeff?
I do sympathize with the staff and with the original intent of the document. I think we are definitely trying to move towards a more pedestrian-friendly environment. That said, I think we'd be having an entirely different conversation if this were downtown Fairhaven or Fountain District. Fact is, it's not. Lowe's is all about driving your car there and buying building materials. The whole shopping center, the premise of it is auto-based, and that's not changing here. And so I think common sense just leads me to agree with the applicant. I think this is a reasonable design, and I think this is one of those instances where, yes, the design standards are ahead of their time and are appropriate for urban village and are appropriate for most other areas of development, but I don't believe that's the case here, and I would support the applicant in their design as shown and as amended.
Garrett?
Well, I thought I appreciated the applicant giving some historical context as to the design standards and why they're here. It is an interesting point that, you know, you're not allowed to have parking abutting Orleans Street and your entrance to a bank. It doesn't make sense on that side. There's kind of conflicting design standards here. As I read it, though, and I look at the building design, I think they meet the intent of the design standard. They're providing access off Orleans Street. It's, you know, not closed off or a big wall. I think it's a nice looking building, and I would tend to agree that they meet that standard as is.
Cerise?
I guess the only thing I would say is when the applicant mentioned safety, and that to me is a very big concern. And so I would agree that to keep it as is and not change it even based on that alone. But I agree with what everyone else has said too. So I'm in agreement with it.
Well, I have a comment to add. I think that it's worth noting that they have complied with all of the other standards. As Garrett noted, you know, the building is oriented the right way. It's set on the corner. It's got architectural character and modulation. It has access. So it doesn't appear to me as if they're trying to skirt the design standards so much as they're just running into some difficulty from a practical standpoint of access. I agree that you don't usually park and then walk around 3/4 or half the building to get to a main entry, as much as we'd all like to be oriented toward the pedestrian interface. I like Tom's idea, and one thing I thought I might suggest is that I don't see any signage at the pedestrian access on this plan. There's no signage called out at all, and it would be easy to add a small waist level sign that says bank entry with an arrow pointing down that walkway so that someone walking along the sidewalk trail who can't see around the corner at the front can look at the sign that says, hey, if you turn here, you will get to the main entrance of the bank. I've seen small signs like that used effectively on commercial projects before. So, I mean, that's like a really easy thing to do, and I would recommend that be included. Other than that, I really agree with what everyone else has said about this, and I don't think I have anything further to add.
Is staff allowed to interject?
If you'd like to comment, sure.
There is, I've seen preliminary design proposal for signage on here. It's very small, very tasteful. It will be at the top, I guess, corner of the large architectural element. And then there's also, it's very small, actually. I was quite pleased to see that, frankly. My one question is, well, first, thank you, Tom, for your suggestion. My other question is, we saw a profile of the architectural wall that's intended to hide the drive-through lane. It's appreciated that you like the idea of moving it south. I'm wondering if that wall, since it's intended to shield vehicles and their headlights, if that could be reduced to just maybe above the height of a typical car. That way, if there is an additional trellis or architectural element along the Orleans side, that would pop a little bit more, and especially with the access from Orleans, allow visibility walking down Orleans or driving down Orleans, where maybe that eastern side could be highlighted a little bit more. So then we don't have to worry about having the actual person entrance off Orleans, but it's still an indicator that, you know what, you can walk through here, where to me, the height of that wall actually blocks a good portion of that side.
Is the intent only to screen lighting and not to screen stacked vehicles using the drive-through?
Well, based on the site plan, I mean, if that wall was moved south just a little bit, if we need to have the site plan, I can put it back up, then it would actually shield more of direct on visibility of cars in the queue lane. But reducing that height would also allow more visibility from that building, or for the building. That makes sense?
It
So
looks
there's
like
going to be enough landscaping, and I think if you've been out there, you've seen that the landscaping that's been installed is already at a significant height and size.
It looks like there's some stairs from the sidewalk to the trail. Is there a grade change at that location?
Yeah, it's a very slight grade change, but at this point, I don't know if there's going to be any balancing
The building will
for the
sit
site.
up.
It may, but I can't see sitting up that much, maybe a couple feet. But again, they'll have to meet the ADA requirements, but again, there's other routes of entry.
Steve?
Okay, looking at that wall, I think the top, it looks like there's a facade or something on top of the wall. Is that 18 feet, 7 inches? And the basic height, then it steps down to what, 10 feet? Is that correct?
I believe
Brian?
so. To my best recollection, yes.
And what you're saying is, your suggestion is to reduce that height, what, 6 feet?
Sure.
It's something to be determined between you and the applicant to a mutual agreement.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine
Again,
with
based
me.
on what Tom was saying about moving it south, opening that up so it's not, as I said, a little peephole of an entrance, and then accenting that side, I think that would just add some elements to it. Make that entry a little more visible and offer additional shielding from vehicular headlights.
I don't know about moving it south. I think it's fine where it is. If you reduce the height, I think I would agree with that. I think we're getting close to a recommendation, a motion for a recommendation here.
Garrett?
I'd like to make a motion just to leave it as designed. Again, I think they meet the design standard. You know, it's not specific. It doesn't say shall or will, like, it's not specific like some of the other design standards. I just don't see why we're playing designer here. I think it meets the criteria, so I move to leave it as is. If they wish to change it or accommodate the city with a change, then that can be at their discretion.
I would second that.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. The motion is to allow the design to remain as is with no entryway change requirements. Garrett, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, is there any discussion on that? Any further discussion?
Not yet, I was,
Thank you.
if I had anything else to say.
Anyone else? Okay. If there's no further discussion, I think we should have a vote on this. So all those in favor, let me restate the motion, even though we just heard it. The motion is to allow the design to proceed as is without any change to entry location requirements. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? It's unanimous. Okay, so that completes the public meeting portion of our meeting. Next on our agenda is a public hearing Thank you, Brian, for presenting. I am going to be, this is a legislative action. However, I'm going to be recusing myself from participation in this discussion with the commission. I'm not involved in this proposal, but it is across the street from a proposal that I have been involved in that I've stepped aside from before, and I feel like it's appropriate to not participate and distance myself from that. So I'm going to turn the meeting over at this point to Garrett, who's our elected vice, and he's going to take over and complete the rest of the meeting and close it out. So thank you guys all, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
See you. We ready? All right, the second item on our agenda this evening is the consideration of a rezone request for property located at 801 Samish Way. The applicants submitted an application last August for docketing request, and in September, the Planning Commission held a public hearing to consider the docketing request and recommended approval to City Council. City Council recommended or approved the docket request, so this rezone proposal is the subject of tonight's public hearing. Stakeholders have submitted written comments which have been reviewed by staff and the Planning Commission. We'll give public testimony tonight, and that public testimony be entered into the record. At the conclusion of the public hearing, the Planning Commission may move to adopt our findings and fact and conclusions and make a recommendation to City Council. The Planning Commission will be considering this rezone based on the rezone design criteria and the comprehensive plan amendment criteria. Lisa Poole is the staff contact for this proposal and will be conducting the presentation for the city this evening. Lisa?
Thank you. Good evening. So as you stated, this is a rezone request for 801 Samish Way from residential single to commercial planned with a non-retail restriction. And this request requires amendments to the Samish Neighborhood Plan and the Bellingham Municipal Code. Pacific Harbor Holdings, LLC, submitted the request for this rezone, and the zoning designation would permit offices, personal service facilities, daycares, apartments in conjunction with other uses, and other commercial uses as noted in the packet. But it would restrict the retail uses and it would allow residential uses outright. The applicant intends to relocate their psychology practice to this site, occupying the existing church that's permitted with a conditional use permit and making minimal changes to the building, primarily internally. This is a site map to show you context. 801 Samish is located right here. It is approximately 1.9 acres in site. It is located east of existing Area 9. Access would be taken from the current access point off Samish Way, which is a secondary arterial and transit route. Surrounding properties include multifamily, single-family, and undeveloped commercially zoned property. I do want to point out Area 9, as you stated, the Planning Commission did recommend approval for that rezoning in November of last year, and what staff is proposing as it moves forward to council will be looking at both proposals, and the rezone requests were so similar that staff would like to combine the 801 Samish with the Area 9 and make it all one Area 9. And then that means that the zoning that you would recommend tonight for 801 would also apply to Area 9. Originally, you had approved it with all of the planned commercial uses in addition to residential permitted outright. But what we're asking for tonight is that both properties be approved with planned commercial, non-retail, residential permitted outright. So feel free to ask more questions on that later. It's a little confusing, but it makes a lot of sense. The code and the comp plan would support this type of designation as opposed to making 801 an additional sub-area. So a little bit of background, as you stated, last October the City Council approved adding this proposal to the docket, and in November the applicants held a neighborhood meeting with several folks in attendance. Concerns were raised regarding expanding the commercial zoning along the stretch of Samish Way, as well as some transportation issues, but there also were several folks in attendance that supported the application. Staff does feel that the application meets the criteria in the code. Specifically, it supports the infill and economic development goals of the GMA. Properties within the vicinity have developed with a variety of uses, and mental health services is a need in our community. Staff also feels that it supports several community goals, including the use of the site by it is served by existing infrastructure, and as I stated, the provision of healthcare options throughout the community. The planned use qualifier provides the framework that addresses site-specific opportunities and concerns and lessens impacts. And as I stated earlier, the applicants intend to use the existing building, which will entail minimal changes to the building and the site. And transportation concurrency and impact fees will be required as part of the permitting process. So just to sum up some of the public comments that have been submitted so far, several in support, stating that the applicants are a stable group, that they will retain character of the site and provide services for those in need. And then several concerns have been raised regarding the compatibility of the rezone with the surrounding uses, cumulative impacts of this proposal as well as the one across the street, and long-term impacts of the proposal. And staff is recommending approval as shown in the attachments of the staff report. Are there any questions at this time? The applicants are here and would also like to make a presentation.
I think if we want to move into the applicant's presentation, we'll have a moment to have questions afterward.
Go.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rodney Anderson. I'm a family physician here in town, and I'm speaking on behalf of the applicant, Pacific Harbor Holdings and Pacific Harbor Psychology. I'm not officially a part of the group, but I will use terms like we and us during the presentation. So this is a picture of the existing church building that has been on this site at 801 Samish Way for approximately the last 25 years. So I want to start by stating what the goals of this group has been from the beginning, and it really has been to try to find a win-win-win-win, that we could find an outcome that would be good for the residents of Bellingham by improving access to these mental health services that are desperately needed within the community, that we could do something that was good for the community by maintaining neighborhood character and preserving a beautiful property and building, as well as protecting the long-term interests of the neighborhood and the neighbors through appropriate zoning. Our hope is that it would be good for the practice as well, specifically really establish a long-term home for this group that has been active members of the community for a long period of time but have not had a permanent place to call home. And then hopefully something that's good for the city that achieves specific goals in the comprehensive plan and also achieves a satisfactory zoning outcome. I just want to take a few minutes to remind the group sort of the history and how we got to this point. So Pacific Harbor Psychology is a group of 9 psychologists. The practice was established a dozen years ago, and there's been very little turnover. Actually, only one member has left the group and been replaced in that interval of time, and that was due to health circumstances. They do serve clients across the demographic spectrum, variety of different ages, and a variety of different mental health issues that these clients are facing. And I would make the comment that they have not and do not take care of any what would be considered dangerous or high-risk clients. Now, Pacific Harbor Holdings is an LLC comprised of 5 members of this group. The LLC was formed for the sole purpose of purchasing a permanent home for the group. I want to take a minute just to remind you about the shortage of mental health services in the community, and this is something that I referenced at the last meeting. I think it's something that we all who work in this field have a sense for. This was taken from the Western Front, published in 2013, and it referenced a panel discussion that was held at Bellingham High School in 2013. It was held in the wake of the Sandy Hook elementary shootings that occurred, specifically to discuss access to mental health services in Whatcom County. And the quote was made that funding had decreased by 11% over the last few years, while the national need for mental health services had risen. I also wanted to point out briefly the wait list times for new patients for some of the providers at Pacific Harbor Psychology. So if you are a new client trying to access services and you call these individuals, this is how long you are waiting to get in for services. And as a primary care physician, I would say that is not acceptable for many of our patients, my patients. And then, as I mentioned at the last presentation, many family physicians in the community can attest to the need of stable mental health services. And anecdotally, two other small points. One is there was another large psychology practice in town here that disbanded in the last few months, which is unfortunate for the community. And I also heard a story yesterday of a patient who called 17 mental health practitioners before being able to schedule an appointment for services. And if you're somebody in need, that is not acceptable. So I think the hope as a primary care physician is that these services expand in the community. This group is not specifically issuing a proposal to expand their group, but stabilizing what we have is a good first step in terms of broadening access to these services. Finding a suitable location for mental health services is a difficult task. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there are some specifics about the location, about parking, about a building that's ADA accessible and such. The folks at Pacific Harbor Psychology spent months and months looking for buildings, and actually over the last dozen years have looked at it at different times, and have really struggled to find anything within the Bellingham city limits that was suitable for their needs. And then they came across 801 Samish Way last July, and that's how the ball got rolling on this process. Lisa mentioned that 801 is kind of a unique property in that it's got three surrounding zoning designations that are different: the single family, multifamily, and then the commercial. I also, throughout this process, I've heard some interesting stories about the Samish Way corridor and how prior to I-5 it was the main thoroughfare into Bellingham, and how the Elks Club, which is just to the north of Area 9, used to be a hopping restaurant in the 80s and 90s. This much predates me. I heard there was a gas station in the area, and I think as you drive this corridor, you can see some of the remnants of that history. I won't spend any time on this, but as you know, there are specific criteria, and I think the city staff has outlined how they feel we've met these criteria. We also submitted a proposal, which I believe you all have reviewed, which explains how we feel we've met those criteria.
1 minute, please.
1 minute. Oh, okay. We've tried very hard to collaborate with the neighbors. We've tried to be transparent throughout the process. I'm just going to zoom through this. And we've received a lot of support from the neighbors in terms of the mission within the community. And obviously, there's been some concerns about the specific zoning change. This is a map just to show you some of the immediate neighbors who have expressed support for this proposal. So there have been those in support and those against. I think we will hear from both sides this evening. Then there are some specific concerns and questions that were expressed. I'm going to just take on two of these: traffic impacts, and then also there was a question I think, Mr. Brown, you raised about what happens to old churches. It was laid out previously that the traffic on Samish Way has decreased over the last 4 years, and this group as a whole would add very little additional traffic to that. Then my final point, I was just going to explain how many old churches struggle to be sold for a whole variety of reasons, and those that do are often converted to, or have been converted successfully to, commercial properties. One particular one that comes to mind is the current home of Bellingham Bay Family Medicine, which used to be the Church of Scientology. The building was remodeled internally and updated externally, and now it's home for primary care practice in an area of town that didn't have those services, and it's a pretty good analogy for what we're trying to do here. So that said, I will turn it over to Simi Jane to answer a few more questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
You need this.
How much time do I have?
5 minutes.
I'm not sure where my files are. On the bottom? Okay. Okay, I think I see them. Thanks. Okay, so there were...
You got slides there?
Yeah, just a couple. I'll just pull them up.
Okay, you got it.
Simi Jane. I'm with Carmichael Clark Law Firm, formerly known as Ender Thurston Law Firm. I'm here representing Pacific Harbor Holdings this evening. And I'm just going to address a few of the more legal issues that have been raised in the public comments briefly now, and perhaps there'll be more to fill in after the rest of the public has spoken. One issue that's come up is whether this proposal would be considered spot zoning. And I just wanted to bring up a little map here as a visual. So first, spot zoning is a zoning action where there's a smaller area singled out of a larger area or district and specially zoned for a use classification, which is totally different from and inconsistent with the classification of surrounding land and not in accordance with the comprehensive plan. The harm that spot zoning, that we're trying to avoid with spot zoning, is to not provide discriminatory benefit to one group of owners to the detriment of their neighbors or the community at large without an adequate public advantage or justification for the rezone. So if you have the adequate public advantage or justification for the spot zone, then the rezone would be valid. I will submit here that if you look at the surrounding uses along Samish Way here, it doesn't appear that this area would be singled out as completely inconsistent with the surrounding uses. There's, as you know, the Elks Lodge over here, which was previously Sarducci's, the Community Baptist Church here. Further down here is Evergreen Motel. And then if you go even further down, there's Samish Woods Montessori. I stopped here. You've all driven Samish Way before. This is one street in the Samish neighborhood where there is pre-existing non-residential uses already. So this use here, which is staying in a non-residential use type, is consistent with the neighborhood and should not be considered spot zoning. Even if it were considered spot zoning, as Dr. Anderson pointed out, there are a lot of benefits to the practice relocating here and for this area to be rezoned. And I won't repeat them since the time is so short. The other issue that's been brought up is whether rezoning this area would create a domino effect. Suddenly, you might find that the Elks Lodge wants to rezone their property, or Community Baptist Church wants to rezone their property. Just want to remind you, there's no domino here, really, because this is already a non-residential use. The church is a non-residential use, and it's going to stay a non-residential use, even with the rezone. Also, let me pull up another slide here. The planned commercial standards here. This is straight from the code, provides some limitations to the future uses that can take place on the property. It says in the criteria that they shall not, where is it? Let's see here. Uses shall not be permitted where prohibited within the applicable neighborhood plan. So if the neighborhood wanted to prohibit certain uses in the future, they could potentially do that through the neighborhood planning process. Also here, it says that next sentence, certain uses may also be excluded from a particular planned area by the planning director if such uses are found to be incompatible with the surrounding area or unsuitable to the particular site. Most of the comments that you've heard, sorry, not heard, but have been submitted don't take issue with the office use being proposed, but more future uses. And so if a future plan development proposal comes to you for this site, the planning director does have some discretion here to exclude certain uses. In addition, as you heard, Ms. Poole state that the residential uses are preserved now in the staff recommendation. So it's quite possible that the future use proposal that you will see could be a planned residential development only and no commercial use at all. It's hard to know what you will see. A lot depends on the market of the property in the future. It's hard to know where retail uses are going to go next, or where the next, I don't know, restaurant's going to be located. There's so much going on already on Seahome that I'm not really sure what the market is for moving high-density commercial uses up on Samish. You know, in my experience, stable professional practices that choose to buy office space in Bellingham keep it, and they keep it for a long time, and when they do sell it, they usually sell to another office. We bought our office from a medical practice in 1992 and have owned it since then, and almost all of the offices in our immediate area are similar.
1 minute, please.
There are some limitations to the site too, which make it maybe not ideal for a lot of different uses to be located there in the future. There are setback requirements, height restrictions, and the site's a little under 2 acres. There's a lot been said about future uses and concerns about future uses. Currently, the special regulations allow offices, branch post offices, banks, financial institutions and libraries, consumer credit agencies, computer data services, public uses, parks and utilities and churches and recycling centers. Those are all now allowed, and the proposal is to streamline what's permitted, keep it simple, restrict retail use from the site, and allow residential uses. The concerns with allowing some of the other uses in the planned commercial zone that I have noticed people raise are fears about property values maybe going down, but I didn't see a lot of data to support that notion. I will say, as the night goes on, if the Planning Commission would like to consider some sort of reduction in the lists of uses allowed for our site, I can't really speak for the other property zoned Area 9. These are some uses here that my client has identified that they would be willing to remove from the list, and I'll just hand those up to commissioners so then you can have it handy for later as we discuss. There's a couple of ways you can go about limiting the uses. Of course, you can add them to the special regulations as you did during your last hearing, or of course, you always have the authority, the city has the authority to require the applicant to enter into a concomitant agreement and condition the rezone and limit uses that way. So there are some mechanisms available to you if there's found to be some direct negative impacts from the proposal to rezone that could maybe be ameliorated by reducing the number of uses on the property. Or, of course, you can accept the staff recommendation, which we support as well. Did you have any questions for me before I sit? Okay, thank you.
I'd like to let both applicants know that we're going to have the commission ask questions of the staff, and if there's a a brief period that you guys would like to come back up and clarify anything that is represented, or questions that come up through the staff's response. We're going to have that opportunity to do that. We're going to open it up to the public comment period. Public comments can be limited to 3 minutes. If we don't have a large agenda, if anybody didn't sign up tonight and wishes to speak, we encourage you to do so. Just line up at the side of the wall there, and we'll go through order here first, and if there's anybody else who would like to speak, they'll have their opportunity. The first gentleman on the list is Mr. Conaboy. Please remember to state your name and address.
Good evening. My name is Dick Conaboy. I live at 165 South 46th Street here in Bellingham. I had a few things to say, but I need to talk to this spot rezone issue, because this is nothing but a spot rezone. If it weren't for this psychology practice, we would probably not be here discussing what to do with this parcel. The parcel is zoned residential single, as are the parcels where the Elks Club and the Community Baptist Church sit. They are under conditional use permits right at the moment, as is the church that's on 801 Samish. All of that is residential. We've been screaming here in Bellingham for infill for years. How are we going to meet the Growth Management Act? And we're going to take a decent residential single parcel and turn it into a commercial zoned parcel. Makes absolutely no sense. The Samish board and the Samish neighborhood in 2007 went over and redid the Samish area plan, the neighborhood plan. And they wanted these areas to be single family. There's no history of a change in that end of Samish Way since 2007, when the board of the Samish neighborhood approved the plan and it was taken to the city council for approval. The Elks Club is where it was. The churches where they were. I got here in 2002, and they were there then. So there's no change in what's going on in that end of Samish Way. And to claim, as the staff did, that there are significant changes which would support this rezone and the rezone across the street just doesn't hold water. Future uses of this, if this psychology practice were to collapse or sell or burn down or whatever, there's no guarantees about who's going to be deciding what goes in there if it's zoned commercial. Right now, Mr. Sepler is our planning director, and I have a lot of confidence in him. But I've been here since 2002, and I tell you, I've come across a couple planning directors. I wouldn't want them deciding anything. So it's all about who's in the driver's seat at the time. So there are no guarantees for what's out there if this group ever decides to sell this parcel once it's zoned commercial.
1 minute, please.
Yes. Pardon?
1 minute, please.
1 minute. Okay, thank you. And this isn't about needs for psychological services. There are a lot of places that this outfit could relocate to. Some are not preferable. I understand that. But it's not about preference for them, and it's not about the needs for the community for a psychological practice. We already have them here. They're in a place they don't like, that's all. But then to change the zoning on this parcel to commercial when we need infill doesn't make any sense at all. Thank you.
Thank you. If it's okay with staff, I think the planning commission probably has questions clarifying some of the. Was there anybody else that would wish to speak that didn't sign up? Sorry. Thank you. Please state your name.
Yes. Heather, my name is Steve Abel, A-B-E-L-L. I live at 1021 34th Street in the Samish neighborhood. I am a member of the Samish Neighborhood Association Board, but I'm speaking tonight as a concerned resident, not part of the Samish Board. The city did not make this any easier when they decided to combine the two parcels into one, because the stated intents of the two proponents are entirely different. Nevertheless, I think this comes down to some pretty straightforward considerations. This is a stable residential area of Samish neighborhood and has been for quite some time. It needs to stay that way. When the city changed the regulation or changed the proposed ordinance to include all the uses that you saw up there, it now includes some uses that I would not be able to approve or even be very fond of. I'm in favor of the psychology group acquiring the church property and converting the building into offices. But in order for that to work well for the neighborhood, we need protection from intrusion of blatantly commercial enterprises, some of which are on that list. I have this nightmare vision of a beauty shop showing up along there with a big bright red neon sign that says Brazilian. We do not need that in Samish neighborhood. I'm hoping that you can find a way to write the zoning proposal such that the psychology group can use the property for what they want to do and to protect the neighborhood from outrageously intrusive commercial enterprises that could go in there based on the new regulations. I'm a little disappointed in the provision that says the planning director may exclude inappropriate uses. That's not good enough. We need more protection than that in order for this to go forward. And the proposal as written right now is not something that I could support without changes that will protect the neighborhood from unwanted commercial intrusions. Thank you.
Thank you. Those, we have another speaker. Please step up, state your name and address for the record.
I'm Ken Chauvel, 816 36th Street. My wife Lisa and I live directly behind the 801 Samish Way property. We were one of the properties highlighted in Dr. Anderson's presentation, so we have a big stake in what happens in our neighborhood. And I can tell you, you should have, first of all, a letter signed by my wife and myself and a few of our neighbors, and I can tell you that there is, from conversations we've had with our neighbors, most of whom are not here tonight, many of whom did not sign letters. I don't really know what else you might have. But I can tell you there's very, very little conversation in the neighborhood that opposes the psychology practice on this property. It's a compatible use for the neighborhood in that a psychology practice and a church have very similar missions, which is a calling to serve the public. And I can tell you also, as unrelated to this project, as a mental health practitioner myself, it is about access to mental health care in this community. In addition to protecting a neighborhood and protecting a very nice piece of property. So I'm here tonight in support of this project, and I hope you will support it also, with maybe some of the caveats that Steve recommended as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Another speaker. Please state your name.
Hi, Ron Judd, 817 Samish. I would respectfully disagree and say it's not about mental health, except for perhaps mine. Some people are trying to frame this into a discussion about, are we in favor of mental health and expansion of mental health services and providing mental health services? Of course. I live in the neighborhood. I'm in favor of that. But your job is not to supply mental health. Your job is to do smart zoning. And I've seen this process go along and this game of sort of bait and switch occur, where we started out with a single-family residential property. There was a list of some possible uses of properties next to it that the attorney for the proponents are now sort of saying those apply to this property, which they don't. As Dick Conboy said, it's single family, the great thing that's in demand in Bellingham, supposedly. And the inventive definition of what a spot rezone is that I heard tonight made my head swim. And in closing, I would just say, My concern as a neighbor is very simple. The proponent's own attorney just told you, looking into the future, quote, I'm quoting now, it's hard to know what you will see. That's the problem. That's the only hang-up I have about this, and the only protection we have as neighbors is smart zoning. So I would just implore you to look at what constitutes smart zoning. And it was nice to see the proponents say that they would take some items, agree to take some items off the list of intended uses as if that's their right. But if they're going to be there forever, they should be willing to just strike all those other uses, right? Because they're going to be there forever. I don't believe it. I don't distrust them. But I can tell you right now, I'm going to be in my house forever, and I'd probably be proven wrong too. So I just hope that you take that into consideration. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Judd. We have another speaker. Please state your name.
Yolanda Graham, 907 36th Street. I guess I have a question or a comment. I don't know if you weigh any differently comments from any speakers who do not live in the Samish neighborhood. And I know when I attended the meeting that they offered for the neighborhood, there was a very strong opponent, and I think he spoke again this evening, who was not a part of the neighborhood. So I guess I would like it to ask you to weigh comments made from those of us who live in the area. The other thing I would like to say is one of the gentlemen who spoke earlier did a good job of notifying all of us in the neighborhood that there was a meeting coming so that we had the opportunity to show and express any concerns. I think there were maybe 10, 12 people that showed, most of them in support. But I think he said he distributed to 20-some houses. The lack of attendance to me says there was either apathy or people supported it, one or the other. So the opposition, of course, you're going to hear the opposition the most strongly. I like that in grouping Zone 9 into this rezoning, it sounds like it's restricting that area a little more than it currently is also, and I'm attracted to that option. So any restriction I would support, but I'm very much in favor of this group being in our neighborhood and hope that you'll give that. They're clean, they're professional, they're safe, just in my mind, they'll make wonderful neighbors. Thanks.
Thank you. Does anybody else wish to speak? We'll give the staff an opportunity to respond if there's any questions that were brought up in the public comment period that you'd like to address or respond to.
Yes, I just wanted to address the issue of combining the applications. We're not combining the applications. They're still separate applications and they're still separate properties. We're taking 801 and instead of making that area 4A, another sub area, we're making that area 9 because the proposals are so similar. And yes, as the person who just spoke stated, that does scale the uses back for the existing area 9 to non-retail.
We're going to let the commission ask questions of staff. We are going to, after some brief questions from the commission to the staff, we're going to allow the applicants an opportunity to provide any clarification if anything's represented through these questions that they would like to shed light on to. So, Jeff?
I had 2 questions for staff. One was, my recollection was that we had come in fairly firmly in support of handling these as 2 separate areas. I think when we looked at that last time, we looked at one is a commercial to expanded commercial residential use. The other is a single-family parcel with, this the matter before us, and that they were separate. And then they got combined, even though we'd recommend the other. And I guess my question is if we want to discuss them separately, and we think that it is appropriate, in fact, to have separate zoning, say, for example, a medical campus or an office campus for 801 and commercial residential for the other one, Is that possible, or is there a technical reason why we can't do what I believe we had intended to do originally?
You certainly can do that.
Okay. We'll come back to that. The second question I had is I had actually asked staff to provide some background on what has happened with other churches. And by way of background, of course, churches get sort of a conditional use entry into single-family neighborhoods based on conditions 50 or 60 years ago when they were 100 or 200 congregations, small churches on corners. That's not the way the industry's gone, as you've probably noticed. So there's a lot of small churches out there. And I'm very curious about what precedent and what guidance and decisions has been used in the past by previous planning commissions, by previous planning department, specifically related to churches that are surrounded by single-family uses. Because I know some of the examples were kind of obliquely referred to there were not necessarily traditional single-family uses, like the Scientology church. I used to live, that's been a restaurant, that's been a daycare, that's been all these different things. I'd like to know exactly what happens when you have a church in a single-family neighborhood and you look at the change of use. And that's what I'd ask for, is if there is any guidance about that, what's happened in the past, what the parameters are, what the decision has been as far as precedent.
Right. I mean, it follows the line of any other use change. I mean, that's how we would handle it. We would look at the code. Is the request allowed in the existing zone? Is it a conditional use permit? And some of the churches that have converted uses that I asked staff about to kind of think of examples, and we did think of 3 or 4 examples of churches that have converted uses in residential zones, and typically they have converted to other residential uses, but there are quite a few, and we definitely support reusing those churches. It's a very sustainable thing to do to not keep those properties vacant and to make sure that they're in use. So.
Okay, so my take-home message from that is there really isn't a city policy on what happens in single-family zones with churches and getting reused. I'm not asking that because I expect them to be torn down. I'm just asking that because I'm sure this issue's come up, and I just want to make sure I understood the precedent.
Right. I mean, we couldn't find an official policy specific to churches.
Steve.
Yeah, I asked this question, I believe it was back in November, and just to make sure that everybody hears it again. The question was, can we attach a conditional use to the new medical offices that are proposing to purchase the property? The answer was, as I believe it, no. It has to be rezoned, commercial planned. Is that correct?
Right. This particular use is not a permitted conditional use currently for residential single zones. So it needs to be rezoned.
Phyllis?
Lisa, I have a question about if we're grouping this with parcel 9 or in section 9, how do those people feel about that at this time? I mean, like I said, we were talking about treating these separately, and all of a sudden they're together, and I feel like we're specifically addressing 801, but what do the people with the rest of 9 think?
They did submit a letter today. You should have hopefully received it, but they're supportive of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm just, for the commission, just kind of my thoughts. I mean, I feel fairly conflicted about this rezone request. It's been brought up that it's significantly different than the other rezone requests across Sandwich Way because it was existing commercial property that had use restrictions that limited the redevelopment or the development potential of it. This property is zoned single family. Jeff brings up a good point that, you know, these buildings that are constructed on, as you know, churches are large buildings, and how are they going to be repurposed? It's difficult to repurpose those buildings. We have language in our comprehensive plan that encourages us to reuse existing infrastructure and use buildings in a way that's responsible as opposed to just tearing them down and building single-family homes. So I think, that's the discussion, here that we're having tonight is what's an appropriate zoning for this parcel, given, we can't ignore the infrastructure that's on it. There is an existing building that's, not suited to residential development. So I'd like to hear, comments on that. And also another thing that's been brought up is there any mechanisms, because, the stakeholders are concerned about, neighborhood residents are concerned about the future use. It seems like everybody can kind of get behind the proposed use. It serves a need in our community. What's next? Are there any mechanisms through a special use qualifier that could revert the zoning back to its original zoning should there be a change of use? I think Jeff kind of hinted at that, and I'd like staff to respond to that, please.
Yeah, there's no way to revert the zoning if you are concerned about future use. I guess our guidance would be to take a look at the uses that would be allowed under the proposed zoning and figure out which ones you're uncomfortable with and strike them from the list would be the way that we would recommend you address that issue.
Just to clarify, as drafted right now, this is proposing for it to be part of Area 9. So any change as drafted in the staff report, any change to this specific parcel would transfer over to the other property in Area 9. Is that correct?
If the staff recommendation is followed, yes.
If that's followed as is. So just a point of distinction.
Yeah, just so we let everybody know, we're talking about future uses. Seems to be a big concern here. We saw a few of them on the wall. Let me go over the list so everybody is comfortable with what we're talking about after the doctor's offices, if in fact they close. The permitted uses would be post offices, banks, financial institutions, libraries, including drive-through financial facilities, all kinds of offices, personal service facilities such as barber and beauty shops, customer credit agencies, laundry and dry cleaning establishments, computer data service, small animal care shops, keeping 3 or few animals, commercial recreation facilities, eating or drinking establishments, repair shops for small equipment and items, public use and facilities where they're similar in nature to other public uses, private clubs and lodges, institutions of higher education, motels, public utilities exclusive of storage yards, service stations for automobiles. Complete minor auto repairs are permitted. However, extensive body work would be prohibited. Public-owned parks, trails, and playgrounds, daycare, apartments in conjunction with other permitted uses, neighborhood clubs and activity centers, mini storage facilities which deal in warehousing of personal residential goods, warehousing and wholesaling of products, bed and breakfasts. So there's, looking down the road, if we decide to go ahead with this commercial plan, there are extensive amount of potential uses for the property, and I think everybody should be aware of that.
Jeff.
So I have a question, and then I wanted to ask a procedural question. I guess the question for staff is, given that it's obvious that the community's neighborhood as a whole is almost unanimous in not being interested in investing commercial rights on that site, but is in many cases supportive of this particular applicant, I just don't see how Area 9 can include both parcels and square that circle. So coming back to my last question, is there a way that is acceptable to staff to create a separate sub-area and then create a designation that does not vest commercial rights, like a planned medical support something? Is there some way to fit the use to the neighborhood's expectation for what that use is going to be in the future without vesting those commercial rights? I guess, can we do that? Is that on the table here?
Let's see, your first question, yes, we can treat these separately. If that's your recommendation, put them into separate zoning categories. That's an option. You can limit the planned commercial uses in any way that you think is appropriate. You can make that recommendation.
But that's the problem I have is that you have a list of 30 items and would be removing 29. You know, is this a little bit nonsensical? And so I'm just wondering, is there a use out there that could be a designation, say like a campus like SPY, essentially, where you're talking about a professional office, low traffic impact, whatever specs you want to put on it. That's the zoning designation. That's what's vested. It's not going to be anything else. That's it. Is that actually an option here?
We don't have a zoning classification like that currently.
You'd have to write it. Okay. I have a procedural question, and that is, so normally we do a motion and then we discuss, and I'm wondering whether we can have a little pre-discussion on whether the commission as a whole feels it's appropriate to combine them into Area 9 or to separate them, and once we make that decision, then we can move on to a motion to treat the area and the matter at hand. Does that make sense to people?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I was hoping to have a kind of a brief question period. We're going to give the applicants an opportunity to come back up and address any new points or questions that were brought up, questions that were addressed by the commission or by the staff. Just going to limit it to 3 minutes. So if you'd like to step up and take that opportunity, now's the time to do that.
So the lot has been talked about for a lot longer than 3 minutes. So it's going to be really hard to stick to that time frame. I just wanted to go back to Dr. Anderson's slide presentation here. This is not it, which will probably take me about 3 minutes to get to. Where did that go?
No.
We did try, Commissioner Brown, to find some examples of churches that we knew about that have been converted, to find some idea of what has happened around our city. This one is on the corner of Texas and Dean Avenue. It's right next to another church, and it's now being used as a duplex. It's in a residential zone. It's sort of a duplex and a shop. I'm sure everyone's aware of that. There's this sort of construction shop in there. This particular property also used to be a church, 1430 North Garden. It's now a dance studio, mainly on the bottom floor, with some artist studio space on the top. And you can see there's a house right next door, and you probably know there's homes behind it there. And then the other one that we showed was the one on the old Scientology church. So I just want to back up for a second that tonight the Planning Commission has an application before them to rezone the Pacific Harbor Holdings property, the old church property, and needs to apply the criteria, the rezone criteria, and to see if the application meets that rezone criteria. I'm a little bit concerned that we're getting deep into the future uses that could happen on this property through a planned commercial development application that might come in the future, when that is not one of the rezone criteria that's before you. I'm not hearing that there's a detriment to the neighborhood to rezone this property plan commercial. The only detriments that I've heard was reduction in property values without any evidence that that will happen. The other one I heard from comments was a domino effect. Again, I'm not sure if that's going to happen either. So I'm a little bit concerned about what the harm is about rezoning the property to planned commercial, given that you will have a planned commercial development application come through this board, this commission in the future. And there are limitations in the standards that will restrict those uses in the future. Also, as I pointed out, the neighborhood has an opportunity through the neighborhood planning process to prohibit certain uses within their neighborhood. They had that opportunity in 2007 to prohibit certain uses from Area 9, the current Area 9, and they didn't do that. And that same long list was in the code then, too. So they could go back and do that and really get all the neighbors to decide which uses will be best for their community and which uses might not work. The reuse of structures is something that the city supports. Tearing down the building and having strictly residential uses at this time is probably not the highest, best, most efficient use of the property. And Commissioner Brown, the neighborhood is not unanimously against the rezone that's being proposed. There's been a few people who've spoken tonight in support of the rezone and a few written statements as well. Certainly there's opposition to it as well, but I wouldn't characterize it as unanimous in opposition to the rezone. There was one more point that my client wanted to address.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm one of the primary applicants. My name is Kate Haskell, and I live at 3276 Spyglass Drive. One of the other elements that I feel needs to be addressed in this conversation about zoning and what is appropriate is also to consider one of the points of why we want this particular property is its location on bus lines and its proximity to Western and its proximity to the freeway. It has been characterized that we could find other locations. I will tell you, and we had a realtor here, Aaron Sundin, earlier, who was for the other project, who happened to show us over 30 properties over the last 7 years. We have looked, we have walked, we have been around the town. We live here, we work here. At this point, that property doesn't pay any property taxes. Churches don't pay property taxes. We will pay property taxes. There's a traffic impact fee that we will pay. This is good for the city in the sense that they are going to have a stable business proximate to the university, one of our largest employers, who's going to provide health care. And I also would say that I have spent hours talking with neighbors, walking neighborhoods, and there is opposition and there is support. And I think that the challenge is none of us know what's going to happen. I live in the Barclay district. I now have a very different setting. Some of it I love, some of it I don't. But I don't have the chance or the belief that change won't happen. And I'd like you to consider that we are a positive change on that site. Thank you.
Thank you. Phyllis.
I have a question of staff. With the laundry list that Steve read to us, are there any changes that would just be automatic, or would anybody in the future have to come before this body or another body to use any of those things that were on the, to create anything that's on that list? Or is there any application that would have to come forth? Does it have another scrutiny point?
Right, it would be an additional rezone process.
Okay, so regardless of what was listed, when the list that Steve read, was that not what would be available if we?
Can I? Yeah, thanks. Those are the uses that would be permitted in commercial planned.
Right, so if we rezone this, those would be available. Is that what I'm, is that what-
Right, but
okay.
as we stated, as has been stated tonight, there is a provision for the planned commercial district that in the future, the neighborhood plan could be amended and the planning director can further restrict those uses through the
Right.
planned development permit process.
But if it were to sell and somebody had a completely different idea about what to do with the property, even if it was on the list, would they have to be approved?
Right, they have to go through a planned development permit
Okay,
process.
okay, so
Yep.
there's a checkpoint at that.
Okay, I thought your question was if any of these uses were, if someone came forward and wanted to change the use list,
No,
that
if they
would be a
wanted to
rezone.
change, if they wanted to use the property for something completely different.
that's a
It's
plan.
on the list. They would
not.
still, it wouldn't be just automatic that they could do it.
It's a planned development permit process. The planning director could
Got it.
restrict
Okay,
uses at
got
that
it.
point.
Thank you.
Lisa, can you remind us when the applicants made their rezone proposal, their application for rezone, what was the proposed zoning that they asked for? Planned commercial? Is it the exact same as what's?
Planned commercial, non-retail is what they asked for through the docketing process. This is the first time you're considering the rezone part of it.
Sure.
Yeah.
The only change to it would be that staff made to it would be the residential use permitted outright.
Right.
That's the only change to what the applicants put their rezone request for.
That was the title of the request, was to go from residential single to planned commercial non-retail. They faxed me a list of uses that they would consider or not consider or maybe consider restricting, but staff came forward with the recommendation that you're looking at tonight.
Right. But it's consistent with the planned commercial rezone request, because there's been some questions among the commission about, we made a clear recommendation that we wanted these treated separately. They keep getting put back together, which has been the direction from council and staff. So Jeff had a question on, if we were to make a motion to separate these parcels. And, the way I see it is they should just remain one area. Because the rezone request is for planned commercial. Whether or not the area, it becomes part of Area 9 or a special zone area, sub-area, doesn't seem to be any mechanism for qualifying the use of planned commercial, so I don't see the value in doing that. This is my thoughts on that.
So just for clarification, you're saying that you don't see any significance in keeping them separate anymore because they're going to be the same anyway?
Well, the rezone request is to rezone the property from single-family to planned commercial.
Correct.
Whether or not it's part of Area 9 or its own sub-area, that's still the rezone request that's in front of us this evening.
But combining them doesn't change anything other than what it,
My understanding is that it adds a non-retail, residential permitted outright use. That's the only change.
okay, got it, thank you.
And you're opposed to that?
No,
Okay.
I don't see the value of creating a sub-area. It's either, we look at the rezone criteria, is it appropriate to be zoned planned commercial, or is it not appropriate to be zoned planned commercial? Jeff?
If I can respond to that, the difficulty I have is that I am sympathetic to the needs of the applicant, and I understand that, and I think it could be an appropriate use for the site. I don't have an issue with that. However, I have heard loud and clear, and I also understand the danger of vesting commercial and having that vested commercial be dependent on a future planning director. It was stated that the planning director could attach conditions or could do it. They could also not. They could also just say, okay. And that's a concern because we're taking a single-family parcel and there's a significant surrounding single-family population and we're vesting commercial rights. And that has nothing to do with who the applicant is. That is a fact that is on the ground here. And so, you know, I would like everybody to be happy. I would like the applicant to be able to use the facility if the neighborhood at large supports it. And by the way, by support it, I mean supporting it within the context of that facility, not supporting the commercial vesting, because I don't know that I heard that there was a lot of support for that. So I'm trying to deal with those. And the mechanism is I realize they made the applicant within the current zoning framework that made the most sense. However, we're dealing with trying to do the best public benefit we can out of this, and that's my problem here, is that I don't think I could support vesting commercial rights there, but I also want to support the applicant in being able to use that facility. So that's my point, is combining them or separating them, and why I might vote one way on one and the other way on the other.
Tom.
Yeah, if I could throw in my 2 cents. I'm really sympathetic to the use, and I think they would be a great neighbor. But for all intents and purposes, this feels like a spot zone to me. Churches are allowed in single-family residence by conditional use. And I'm really hesitant for us to set a precedent to rezone other conditional use properties that may come up with congregations getting older and disbanding, that kind of thing. You know, there are some unscrupulous people in this world. I'm sure none of them are here tonight. That I feel would love to be able to have some kind of alleyway to maneuver to get these conditional use non-viable properties into some other zone. And I'm really hung up about that. My gut feeling is that I'm going to vote no on a rezone unless it's its own separate zone, say sub-area 9A, and it's planned professional offices only. Maybe that would be a compromise that everybody can live with. And then we deal with the property across Samish entirely separately. Samish Way seems to me to be a logical boundary, because that property goes from Samish Way down to the freeway. Planned commercial in that area with the height restrictions that could be imposed might make fine neighbors, but that's my feeling, is that I'm gut feeling voting no unless we make it a separate parcel and professional offices only.
Can I direct a question to the staff on this? This has been brought up kind of repeatedly here. The rezone request that's before us is from the applicant is planned commercial. There's been direction or to creating a sub area with its own specific zoning and qualifying the uses that are permitted. within that zone. Is that even a desire of the applicant? If so, that's not the proposal that's in front of us. So where do we go with that?
Well, it would still be planned commercial, but you would limit it to offices. There's not a planned professional offices. It would have to be still planned commercial with just the offices permitted.
Yeah, but I don't want all state insurance going in there. I don't want all state insurance
There's
going in
not a
there.
specific use within the planned commercial zoning that says a particular type of office.
Get out your whiteout and change it, Lisa.
Well, we've had a lot of discussion on this topic. It seems like there's still some questions out there. Is there any other questions for the staff from members of the commission? Any other discussion? Phyllis?
Well, I was just going to say, I think keeping them separate sounds to be the smart thing to do at this time.
Which we can do.
Yeah, and then I'm liking what Tom is saying. If we can give them what they want for the time being, who knows what's going to happen when the next person would buy, but if they're restricted now, they would still have to go through applications and changes. And if it satisfies the applicant to be able to do what they want to do now, and that those future restrictions are not of a concern of theirs now, because they're thinking about being there forever, then maybe that's the solution we should be looking to coordinate.
Jeff?
Just to follow up on that, my opinion is the city has a certain toolbox of its use qualifiers and what they're familiar with, and if the toolbox isn't big enough to do what you want to do, get another tool. And it may very well be that in some instances, future rezonings in other locations, it may be appropriate to have a low-intensity, low-impact, campus-style medical facility that might fit in other zones. And I don't, if we feel strongly, and we may or may not as a body, but that there's a certain use that's appropriate for it, but not other uses, even within the office criteria, split it up, make something new. I don't, I know you have to think through what another use would be, but it seems like that's part of our job, is to try to figure out better ways to do things as time goes on. So that was my only comment there.
The applicants have submitted a list of use restrictions that they would support. We've heard public testimony from stakeholders in neighborhood, kind of demonstrating their leanings. I think, at this point, we should entertain a motion and have a discussion and try to frame this in a way that we can make a recommendation to council to move that forward.
Well, I would move that we keep 801 separate from Area 9, and we vote on that first, and then take the next step. I make that motion.
I'll second that.
We have a motion on the table to have 801 Samish, a separate zoning area from Area 9 of the Samish neighborhood. It's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? It's 5-0. 6-0, sorry. Thank you. So I think the next kind of topic of discussion is the use. Right now, the rezone request is to be planned commercial. That is what's being proposed. There are use limitations that could be applied to the separate zoning district. Do we have a motion on uses? Jeff?
Well, I guess I'm comfortable with coming up with a general concept, perhaps, and directing staff and the applicant to try to figure out what works in consultation with the neighborhoods. I don't know that I want to do any wordsmithing on what the exact parameters would be. So I guess if there's a general feeling on maybe The real question is, should it just be an office designation only? Or again, you don't want some big complex to go in there. Should it be a low-intensity office that's a new designation or something? And again, we're just making a recommendation to the City Council for them to actually decide what they want to do. But maybe if we just frame it in a general concept, that's sufficient? Is that the kind of direction you would want out of this?
No, I mean, we would prefer planned commercial limited to offices of all kinds, which is a current use in the planned commercial list. Well, I mean, going back and, you know, evaluating other zoning districts and rewriting code is not something I don't think that we are interested in.
Steve?
Yeah, the way it reads is offices of all kinds, and I would be against that.
Well, the applicants, again, have submitted use restrictions that they were comfortable with. We've heard from the stakeholders. So we've made a motion and passed to treat 801C as a separate sub-area. It's not associated with Area 9. We need a motion to vote whether or not this is an appropriate rezone to be rezoned commercial from single family. Commercial planned. Jeff?
I just wanted to make a comment first, but it seems like if we get rid of all those things on the list other than offices, we've made a big headway. And that, even though there might be some specific offices, I'm not sure exactly what they would be, that might be offensive, that at least they're not, you know, slaughterhouses or, you know, whatever else that, you know, could go in. So I'm very comfortable with that if that meets the needs of the applicant. I think that's very important to meet the needs of the applicant. I'll be getting a nod.
Jeff?
So here's a technical question for staff is, so if we go with the use qualifier for offices only, how does the neighborhood plan interact with that in the future? Because one option we would have is to go ahead with that designation because it exists, and then in the record, if we agree with this, to state that we favor low-intensity office use as is proposed, and that is future intent that could be passed on to the planning director as part of the record, but also for the neighborhood association to clarify in their plan when the time comes of what parameters would be on there. Would that actually have standing in the planning director's decision if it's like a medical facility or something like that as opposed to just a general office? Can they themselves further define what that would mean?
That's my understanding. If you're creating another sub-area tonight and doing what it sounds like in the direction you're heading in, then we have to develop that language for the neighborhood plan specific to the office use.
Cerise, did you have a comment?
I have a comment, but Stephen, go next.
Steve?
According to the Samish Neighborhood Plan, it states, whenever increased residential densities and mixed-use development are proposed, the approval should be contingent on properties that are done in areas which minimize impact on single-family development. Further, on page 5 of the plan, it states, the following characteristics are highly valued by residents and should be retained: large lots, single-family zoning, natural open spaces, views and trees consistent with Bellingham Comprehensive Plan. So that's what the plan states, and it sounds like it's opposed to what we've been talking about. So we can't go around the plan. The plan is specific. It is stated very clearly, and I don't want to go against Samish Neighborhood Plan.
Cerise, do you have a comment?
Thank you. I'm not going to vote for this. I'm going to vote against it, not what the staff recommendation is. I actually agree with the staff recommendation. And I think that we're all being, or not everyone, I think it's a little short-sighted not to think forward, positive change. Someone mentioned that earlier. I think a lot of these things that are currently in the rezone actually might benefit the neighborhood. And I think, at least if I live there, there's some things that I wouldn't mind on this list in my neighborhood. And I think of Samish Way as a pretty busy street, which seems like a natural fit for a lot of these things. So I guess I just want to say that I think there's a lot of benefit here that we're maybe missing by limiting it too much. And I think that instead I would rather do this and residential. And so adding residential, like adding the two zonings together, I see the benefit of that. So yeah, there's my 2 cents.
Jeff? Yeah, we're ready to entertain a motion.
Okay, I'd like to move that we, I don't know if we're directing staff to do this, or that we simply support the office use qualifier only, and that we, in a new sub-area, and that we would like to footnote this, that our intention is to support low-intensity use of the site, as is proposed by the applicant.
We have a motion, we have a second.
Second.
Any discussion, any further discussion? Steve?
One of our primary responsibilities on the Planning Commission is to recommend things to City Council. Trying to do some due diligence, I checked up on several things in the past week. And the first question was, what is zoning? Let's get very basic here, folks. What is zoning? I checked out a definition and scope from independent sources not associated with the City of Bellingham or the State of Washington. What I found the following: the primary purpose of zoning is to segregate uses that are thought to be incompatible. In practice, zoning is also used to prevent new development from interfering with existing uses and or preserve the character of the community and or the neighborhood. We haven't had any talk tonight about preservation of the character of the neighborhood, but it's very clear that the Growth Management Act states it, Bellingham Comprehensive Plan states it, and most important, the Samish neighborhood restates it. Character says the Samish neighborhood plan focuses on developing and maintaining neighborhood scale and character, consistent with the Bellingham Comprehensive Plan update that is governing low-density zoning with single-family residents and with current lot size and requirements. This proposed change, we are talking about long-term and not short-term. I don't want to make focus that we're just talking about the applicant tonight, because we're not. We're talking about long-term uses. And I don't want to lose sight of that fact. And I just hate spot zoning. I think it's inappropriate. You look at this piece of property, I drove it up 32nd, all around it, way up to the Evergreen Motel and back again. I just think that it's inappropriate that we are opening the doors in the middle of a single-family neighborhood with single-family residents on all three sides governed by Samish Way, a natural barrier which Commissioner just spoke about. I am against the proposal and I will vote no on it.
There's a motion on the table. The motion on the table is to support recommendation for rezoning the property to commercial planned with a use limitation of offices only. Jeff made the note that footnote of low impact into the zoning table. There is precedent for this kind of zoning. There's areas in the lettered streets that have offices only, residential multi with office use. Commission brings up good points about neighborhood character. There's balance between repurposing older buildings, economic vitality. There's lots of things in our economic chapter that would provide support for this. So if there's any more comments, I'd like to call the question, put it to a vote.
I just want to ask Lisa, is this something that's consistent with what you would be able to handle if we were to vote yes on that particular proposal?
Right, we would modify the findings and develop that sub-area language for the neighborhood plan.
Okay, thank you.
All those in favor of the motion on the table, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
No.
So 4-1, 4-2? 4-2, motion passes. Okay, this time correct. At this time, we'll close the public hearing. Anybody that would like to leave may leave.
I find it very difficult. You know, those are very difficult kinds of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's cut the baby in half.
There's shopping cart, there's an I-5 exit. I mean, that place is normal. That's a normal.
I mean, it's like, you get the crystal ball out.
I mean, I'm not
you know,
talking
I mean,
about like
geez.
in the neighborhood, you know.
It is in the neighborhood.
Not Sandwich is right. I mean, if
That's a divider.
But
That's
yeah,
a
but
divider.
if the church was up in the neighborhood, you know.
When you look at the property, it's three-tiered. Anybody going in there can actually get within feet, other than setbacks of those single-family homes.
Okay, we're going to conclude the balance of our meeting. Mr. Alcott. Old business, new business, next scheduled meeting.
Don't have any older new business. Do any of the commissioners have any older new business?
I have one question.
I do too. You go ahead, Steve. Steve has a quick question, guys.
Well, you talk about it.
I have a question that
Sure.
came up. Is it possible to send us the definition and the difference between a meeting, a public meeting, and a public hearing? Tonight, we did a public meeting, and we also had a public hearing.
Yeah, usually the code calls out the type of meeting depending on the type of application. So
They're conducted in the
For
same
instance,
manner.
primarily, they're conducted in the same manner, yes. It's a quirk of our code.
I had a question, just kind of, on the agenda tonight, there's staff introduction and presentation, then there's public hearing. There was two applicants that had wanted to make, a presentation that really aren't listed on the agenda. I think it'd be really helpful if we knew in advance that an applicant had a prepared presentation, especially related to time limits. I think Commissioner Taishi kind of struggled with that at the beginning of the meeting. The applicant got up and said, I'm the applicant, I have a presentation, am I limited to the same amount of time as the other speakers? We should have a policy on that. How long do we want to give applicants and a general idea, the 10 minutes, and then for public comment, we should have some general guidelines I think would be helpful because, when you're putting together a presentation, I felt like those folks may have been rushed a little bit, and so I would like to have some guidance on that if we could, please.
Yeah, we generally work with the applicants, and then they'll let us know how much time they think they're going to need. We generally try to encourage them to be brief as possible, because often there's a lot of public here that wants to speak as well, and so we don't want applicants taking up the entire meeting time. I think it's difficult to set a policy because things are so, applications can be so different depending on the number of people in the room. You might want to limit speakers to 3 minutes, or you might feel like 5 or even 10 is more appropriate if there are only a few speakers. So it's really at the discretion of the chair. If we know that an applicant is going to make a presentation and approximately how much time they're going to need, we can add that to the agenda.
That would be great. I mean, obviously, all these got to deal with this, but if it was just, staff spoke to the applicant, they have, a PowerPoint that's pretty extensive, they're going to need about 15, 20 minutes. If that was on here, then they wouldn't feel rushed. They could feel like they get through their material properly, and so that'd be great.
Okay, we can do that.
Jeff?
I just want to make a comment on that. I've always kind of viewed those as an adjunct to the staff presentation that's coordinated with you, so you're not covering the same ground. So I actually wouldn't even really consider it public comment per se. As part of that whole public comment process, it's actually part of the application and the staff report that's being presented. So I think the most important thing to me is that you guys coordinate presentations so there's not overlapping information that we're sitting through, because they feel it's public comment and they need to reiterate. And I think you do that. So that's the way I look at it.
Heather reminded me that there was one issue that came up that we wanted to discuss with you very briefly. And actually, Steve was the one who raised it. The Planning Commission has an email address, and people send stuff to it. And sometimes it's advertisements, sometimes it's training opportunities or upcoming activities in the community. We generally forward all of that to you. We don't decide what goes to you and what doesn't. And I think that's the way we would like to handle it. So you may see things in your email and you're wondering, why the heck am I getting this? Well, if it came in on your email site, you're probably going to get it. So just so you know, there's no endorsement by staff of any of this stuff unless we say this training is something we think you ought to consider or something like that. Just wanted you to be aware so you don't wonder, why the heck am I getting this application? And Lisa has one thing.
Hopefully you all have received the save the date for our March 17th open house on the comprehensive plan. We're having a St. Patty's comp plan open house. We'll make sure to have the shamrock cookies. And it's from 6 to 8, March 17th at the Squalicum Boathouse, which is in Zwanich Point Park. And we're getting the word out, so hope to see you there.
Is there green beer?
No alcoholic beverages.
And you need a response on that, don't you?
We don't. No RSVPs needed.
Oh, really? Okay.
No. Just show
The
up.
6 to 8 on the 17th.
6 to 8 on March 17th, and you'll be receiving lots more information, I'm sure.
Thank you. Okay, meeting adjourned.